Story 1. Story 1, The Whispering Pines. The late afternoon sun, a hazy orange orb, dipped below the tree line as I pedaled further into the Whispering Pines. My breath puffed white clouds in the crisp autumn air, a stark contrast to the vibrant foliage clinging to the branches. It was a familiar route, one I'd biked hundreds of times, a comforting loop through the state park near my home. The crunch of gravel under my tires, the rhythmic whirring of the chain, the rustle of falling leaves, all were soothing sounds I associated with peace and solitude. That day, however, something felt off. It started subtly, a prickling at the back of my neck, the unsettling feeling of being watched. I dismissed it as nerves. I'd been working long hours, stressed about deadlines. It was probably just my imagination. Just enjoy the ride, Sarah, I muttered to myself, gripping the handlebars tighter. The deeper I rode, the more intense the feeling became. The Whispering Pines, usually a melodic backdrop, now seemed to murmur secrets, their voices growing louder, more insistent. I could almost distinguish words, hushed whispers that slid just beneath the threshold of comprehension. I stopped, resting my bike against a moss-covered boulder. The silence was even more unsettling. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the frantic thumping of my own heart. I scanned the woods, my eyes darting between the lengthening shadows. Nothing. Just the trees, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. "Hello?" I called out, my voice a shaky tremor in the stillness. No response. I pushed off again, my legs pumping harder now, a desperate need to escape the suffocating silence, the oppressive feeling of being watched. The whispers grew louder, morphing into a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath me. As dusk deepened, the shadows grew longer, twisting into grotesque shapes that danced at the periphery of my vision. I saw movement in the trees, glimpses of something dark, something wrong. I tried to rationalize it. Deer. Coyotes. Anything but the chilling certainty that something else was out there, something that was watching me, hunting me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was my husband, Mark. "Hey, where are you?" or his voice crackled through the speaker. "It's getting dark." "I'm almost home," I lied, my voice strained. "Just finishing up my ride." "Okay, be careful." "Love you." "Love you too," I whispered, ending the call. The lie hung heavy in the air, as thick and suffocating as the silence. Suddenly, a branch snapped behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Nothing. Just the wind rustling through the trees. But the whispers were louder now, closer. They were no longer whispers. They were words, clear and distinct, spoken in a voice that chilled me to the bone. "We see you." Terror seized me. I clipped my feet into the pedals and flew down the trail, the bike bouncing and swaying over the uneven ground. The whispers chased me, echoing through the woods, a chorus of unseen voices. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I burst out of the woods and onto the road, the streetlights a welcome beacon in the encroaching darkness. I didn't stop pedaling until I reached my driveway, my legs trembling with exhaustion and fear. I stumbled into the house, slamming the door behind me, locking it, bolting it. I leaned against the cool wood, gasping for breath, my heart still pounding in my chest. Mark came into the hallway, his brow furrowed with concern. "Sarah? Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to tell him, to pour out the terror that still gripped me, but the words wouldn't come. I could only shake my head, my eyes wide with a fear I couldn't explain. He put his arms around me, holding me close. "It's okay," he murmured. "You're safe now." But I wasn't safe. I knew I wasn't. Because as I stood there, wrapped in my husband's embrace, I heard it, faint, but unmistakable. The whisper. Just outside the window. "We're still watching." And then, silence. A heavy, oppressive silence, filled with the unspoken promise of something terrible yet to come. I haven't biked since. I can't. The whispers are always there, waiting in the shadows, reminding me that I am never truly alone. They're waiting. I don't know for what. But I know they're waiting. Story 2. Story 2, The Whistling Pines. The crisp October air whipped at my face as I pumped my legs, the familiar whir of my tires a comforting rhythm against the backdrop of rustling leaves. The sun, already low in the sky, painted the pines in hues of orange and purple, casting long, dancing shadows across the forest floor. This was my sanctuary, the Blackwood Trail, a winding path through the dense woods bordering our small town. I'd biked it hundreds of times, every dip and curve etched in my muscle memory. "See you at dusk, Mom," I'd called, grabbing my helmet and water bottle. "Be careful, honey," she'd replied, her voice laced with that familiar maternal worry. I'd smiled, a reassuring gesture I now regretted. The ride started normally enough. The familiar crunch of gravel under my tires, the scent of pine needles, the distant chirping of birds. As I delved deeper, the trees grew thicker, sunlight struggling to penetrate the dense canopy. The air grew noticeably cooler, a dampness clinging to my skin. Then I heard it. A low, almost melodic whistle, carried on the wind. I slowed, listening intently. It stopped. Just the wind, I reasoned, the rustling of leaves through the branches. I started pedaling again, picking up speed, eager to shake the unsettling feeling. The whistle returned, closer this time, accompanied by a rhythmic thudding that seemed to vibrate through the ground. My heart pounded against my ribs, the tranquil ride now tainted with an insidious unease. I glanced over my shoulder, but saw nothing through the dense foliage. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the vast stillness of the woods. Silence. Only the wind whispering through the pines. I pushed on, my legs burning, the thudding growing stronger, the whistling more insistent. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I felt eyes on me, the prickling sensation of being watched. A shiver ran down my spine. This wasn't the familiar comfort of the Blackwood Trail. This was something else. The sun dipped lower, the woods growing darker, the shadows lengthening into grotesque shapes. I gripped the handlebars tighter, my knuckles white, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to turn back, but a primal fear kept me moving forward, a morbid curiosity urging me on. Then I saw it. A flicker of movement in the periphery. Something large, dark, shifting between the trees. I couldn't make out a distinct shape, but it moved with an unnatural fluidity, gliding through the undergrowth like smoke. The whistling intensified, a chilling melody that seemed to bore into my skull. Terror gripped me, a cold hand squeezing my heart. I pedaled harder, the bike bouncing over roots and rocks, my legs screaming in protest. The thudding grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right behind me. I risked a glance over my shoulder. Nothing. But the whistling persisted, the thudding resonated, and the feeling of being watched intensified. I was no longer alone in the woods. I was being hunted. The trail narrowed, the trees closing in around me like clawing hands. The air grew thick with an unfamiliar scent, musky and metallic, making my stomach churn. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows that danced and writhed like grotesque figures, their movements mimicking the unseen entity stalking me. Ahead, the trail curved sharply around a massive, ancient oak. As I rounded the bend, I slammed on the brakes, my front tire skidding on the loose gravel. Standing in the middle of the trail, bathed in the last rays of the setting sun, was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long and thin, its skin a sickly pale grey. Its head was elongated, almost skeletal, with huge, black eyes that seemed to absorb all light. It stood motionless, its long, spindly fingers twitching slightly. And from its gaping maw came the whistling, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate the very air around me. I stared at it, frozen in terror, my mind struggling to comprehend what my eyes were seeing. It was a nightmare made flesh, a creature from the deepest, darkest recesses of my imagination. Then, it moved. With a speed that defied logic, it lunged towards me, its long, skeletal fingers outstretched. I screamed, a primal cry of pure terror, and threw myself off the bike, scrambling into the undergrowth. Thorns ripped at my clothes, branches scraped my skin, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I crawled through the dense foliage, my heart pounding in my chest, the whistling echoing in my ears. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I ran, blindly, desperately, through the darkening woods, the terrifying image of the creature burned into my mind. I eventually stumbled onto a fire road, my body bruised and bleeding, my clothes torn, my mind reeling. I flagged down a passing car, babbling incoherently about the creature, the whistling, the thudding. The driver, an elderly woman, looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear. She didn't believe me, of course. Nobody would. I'm home now, safe, or so I tell myself. But the whistling still haunts my dreams. The thudding still echoes in my ears. And I know, deep down, that the creature is still out there, in the woods, waiting. Waiting for me. I never went back to the Blackwood Trail. I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind whispers through the pines, I hear it. That low, melodic whistle. And I wonder, is it coming closer? Story 3. Story 3, The Whistlers. The late afternoon sun, filtered through the canopy, cast long shadows on the asphalt as I pedaled my vintage Schwinn along the bike trail. It was a familiar route, one I'd taken hundreds of times, winding through the wooded park that bordered my suburban town. The air, crisp with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, usually brought me a sense of peace. Today, it felt different. Heavy. My headphones, blasting an upbeat playlist, were a flimsy barrier against the oppressive quiet of the woods. I pulled one bud out, letting the natural sounds of the park filter in, expecting the chirping of birds or the rustle of leaves. Instead, I heard a faint, high-pitched whistling. I dismissed it as a bird, or maybe a kid messing around in the distance. But it persisted, growing slightly louder with each turn of the pedals. It seemed to be coming from somewhere behind me, just beyond the tree line. Unease began to prickle at the edges of my calm. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. Just the dense woods, shadows deepening in the late afternoon light. I plugged my earbud back in, cranking up the volume. The whistling cut through the music. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pedaled faster, the wind whipping past my face, but the whistling kept pace, a chilling counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of my breathing. I passed another cyclist, a middle-aged woman in brightly colored spandex. She gave me a cursory nod, a tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I wanted to stop, to ask her if she heard it too, but the words caught in my throat. What would I say? Do you hear that creepy whistling? She'd think I was crazy. Instead, I forced a smile back, my face stiff, and kept pedaling. The woman disappeared behind a bend in the trail. The whistling grew louder, closer. It wasn't a single note anymore, but a series of fluctuating tones, almost melodic, but undeniably unsettling. It felt like it was inside my head, echoing in my skull. I glanced back again. Still nothing. Just the trees, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze, their shadows long and distorted. The setting sun cast an eerie orange glow over everything, making the familiar woods feel alien and threatening. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to get out of the woods. I pedaled furiously, my legs burning, my lungs aching. The whistling seemed to intensify with my speed, mocking my desperation. I reached a section of the trail that ran alongside a busy road. Cars whizzed past, their headlights cutting through the deepening gloom. I felt a surge of relief. Surely, I was safe now. But the whistling didn't stop. It followed me, weaving through the roar of traffic, insinuating itself into the sounds of the city. I pulled off the trail, onto a side street, hoping to lose whatever was following me. I glanced behind me, scanning the faces of the passing drivers. Did they see it? Did they hear it? Their expressions were blank, indifferent. I reached my street, the familiar houses and manicured lawns offering a semblance of normalcy. But the whistling persisted, a constant, insidious presence in my ears. I flew off my bike, stumbling up the driveway to my front door. My hands fumbled with the keys, dropping them twice before I finally managed to unlock the deadbolt. I slammed the door shut behind me, leaning against it, gasping for breath. The silence inside the house was deafening. The whistling had stopped. I stood there for a long time, listening, waiting. The only sound was the frantic thumping of my own heart. I checked all the windows and doors, locking them securely. I peered out into the street, but there was nothing there. Just the streetlights casting pools of yellow light on the empty pavement. I went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside my window, sounded like the whistling, returning to haunt me. The next day, I didn't go for a bike ride. I stayed inside, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But the memory of the whistling, the oppressive silence of the woods, the unsettling feeling of being watched, lingered. A few days later, I saw a news report about a missing person. A woman, about the same age as the cyclist I'd passed on the trail. She'd been last seen riding her bike in the park. The police were asking for anyone with information to come forward. I stared at the woman's picture on the screen, a knot forming in my stomach. It was her. The woman in the brightly colored spandex. The woman who'd given me that tight-lipped smile. I thought about calling the police, about telling them what I'd heard, what I'd seen. But the words wouldn't come. What would I say? I heard whistling? They'd think I was crazy. Besides, what if it wasn't just whistling? What if? I turned off the TV, the image of the missing woman burned into my mind. The whistling started again, faint at first, then growing louder, echoing in the silence of my living room. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside. From inside me. And then, I heard a knock at the door.